The gavel slammed down with finality as tears streamed down Alan's weathered face. After 30 years of saving lives as a firefighter, his career was about to end in disgrace over accusations he knew were false. But then 2 young women stood up in the packed courtroom, their voices cutting through the tension like a blade. "Your Honor," one of them said, her voice trembling with emotion, "this man saved our lives 15 years ago, and we've been searching for him ever since." What happened next would shock everyone in that room and prove that sometimes the people you save end up saving you right back. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button for more real, emotional, life-changing stories like this, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The rain hammered against the windshield of Engine 47 as it raced through the winding mountain roads of Pine Valley. Alan Rodriguez gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white against the worn leather as he navigated the treacherous curves. Behind him, his crew of 4 seasoned firefighters checked their equipment one final time, the familiar ritual bringing calm to the chaos of an emergency response. The radio crackled with updates from dispatch, painting a grim picture of a multi-vehicle accident on Highway 9, complete with injuries and at least one vehicle that had rolled multiple times before coming to rest in a steep ravine. At 42 years old, Alan had seen his share of mangled metal and broken lives scattered across asphalt, but something about this call felt different. Maybe it was the way the storm had rolled in so suddenly, turning what should have been a routine evening into a nightmare of reduced visibility and slick roads. Or perhaps it was the fact that his own 8-year-old daughter, Sophia, was supposed to be traveling this same stretch of highway with her grandmother just an hour earlier, returning from a weekend visit to relatives in the next county. He'd called to check on them twice already, relief flooding through him each time he heard Sophia's sleepy voice confirming they'd made it home safely. The scene that greeted them as Engine 47 rounded the final curve was worse than the radio reports had suggested. 3 vehicles were involved in what appeared to be a chain reaction collision. A sedan sat crumpled against the guardrail, its front end compressed like an accordion, while a pickup truck had spun completely around and now faced oncoming traffic. Its driver slumped over the wheel but conscious enough to wave weakly at the approaching fire truck. But it was the 3rd vehicle that made Alan's blood run cold, a silver SUV that had somehow managed to punch through the metal barrier and flip end over end down the embankment, finally coming to rest on its roof against a cluster of pine trees about 60 feet below the roadway. "Jesus Christ," muttered Rodriguez, Alan's lieutenant and closest friend on the crew, as he surveyed the carnage through the rain-streaked windows. How the hell did that thing end up down there? The answer would later be determined by state police investigators to the combination of excessive speed, wet roads, and the driver who had swerved to avoid the initial collision between the sedan and pickup, only to lose control entirely and launch his vehicle through what should have been a protective barrier. Alan was already grabbing his rappelling gear before the truck had come to a complete stop. 23 years with the Pine Valley Fire Department had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now every fiber of his being was screaming that whoever was trapped in that overturned SUV didn't have much time. The vehicle was positioned precariously against the trees, and he could see steam rising from what remained of the engine compartment, along with the telltale shimmer of gasoline pooling beneath the wreckage. "Thompson, Rodriguez, get the jaws started and work on the vehicles up here," Alan barked orders as he secured his harness and checked his rope system. "Martinez, I need you spotting me on this descent, and somebody get me a medic down there as soon as we know what we're dealing with." The team moved with practiced efficiency, each man knowing his role in the carefully choreographed dance of emergency response that they'd performed hundreds of times before. The descent down the rain-slicked embankment was treacherous, made worse by the gathering darkness and the fact that Alan could hear something that chilled him to the bone, the high-pitched screaming of children coming from inside the teen. Mangled SUV? Not the cries of teenagers or young adults, but the pure terror of very young voices calling for help. His boots found purchase on exposed roots and rocky outcroppings as he worked his way down, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom to reveal the full extent of the vehicle's damage. The SUV had clearly rolled multiple times before the trees had arrested its violent tumble. Every window was shattered, the roof was compressed down to what couldn't have been more than 3 feet of interior space, and the engine had been driven back into the passenger compartment by at least 2 feet. But somehow, miraculously, the rear section of the vehicle remained relatively intact, and it was from this area that the children's voices were emanating. "Hey there, can you hear me?" Alan called out. As he reached the wreckage, his voice deliberately calm and reassuring despite the urgency of the situation. "My name is Alan, and I'm here to help you. Can you tell me your names?" The response was immediate, 2 small voices speaking almost in unison, their words tumbling over each other in their haste to communicate. "I'm Emma, and this is Olivia," one of the girls called back, her voice surprisingly steady for someone who couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old. "Our mommy won't wake up and there's glass everywhere and Olivia's arm is bleeding really bad." The second voice, presumably Olivia, was crying softly but trying to be brave, asking if their mother was going to be okay and when they could go home. Alan's heart clenched as he worked his way around the vehicle, searching for the best point of entry. Through the shattered rear window, he could make out 2 small forms huddled together in what had been the back seat, now pressed uncomfortably close to the roof by the vehicle's inverted position. Both girls appeared to be secured in car seats that had somehow remained anchored despite the violence of the crash, a factor that had undoubtedly saved their lives. In the front of the vehicle, he could see the crumpled form of an adult woman, presumably the girl's mother, who appeared to be unconscious and trapped beneath the steering column that had been forced down by the roof's compression. Blood covered much of her face and clothing, and Alan could see that her breathing was shallow and irregular. The woman needed immediate medical attention, but his first priority had to be getting the children out of the vehicle before the pooling gasoline found an ignition source, or the precariously balanced SUV shifted position. "Okay, Emma and Olivia, I'm going to get you out of there," Alan said, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that had made him one of the most respected firefighters in the county. "But I need you to be very brave and do exactly what I tell you, okay? Can you do that for me?" Both girls responded affirmatively, and Alan could hear in their voices the kind of trust that children place in adults during their darkest moments, a responsibility he'd never taken lightly. Working with tools passed down from his crew above, Alan began the delicate process of creating an opening large enough to extract the children. The rear window had been completely destroyed in the crash, but the frame was twisted and filled with jagged edges that would need to be cleared before he could safely pull the girls through. Every few minutes, he would pause in his work to check on the children, talking to them about anything he could think of to keep them calm and alert. "So, Emma, what's your favorite subject in school?" he asked as he carefully removed a particularly dangerous shard of glass from the window frame. The answer came back that she loved reading, and that she and Olivia had just finished a book about horses during the car ride. Olivia chimed in that she preferred math because numbers made sense to her in a way that words sometimes didn't, and that she wanted to be an engineer when she grew up so she could build bridges. These small conversations served a dual purpose, not only keeping the girls calm, but also allowing Alan to assess their mental state and watch for signs of serious injury or shock. From what he could observe, both children appeared to be alert and responsive, though Olivia was indeed bleeding from a cut on her left arm, and Emma seemed to be favoring her right shoulder. More concerning was the fact that their mother's condition appeared to be deteriorating, her breathing becoming more labored with each passing minute. "Martinez, I need that medic down here now," Alan called up to his spotter, who immediately relayed the request over the radio. "And give me another length of rope. I'm going to need to haul these kids up one at a time." The response came back that paramedic Williams was already gearing up for the descent and would be down within minutes, bringing with her the additional medical equipment that would be needed to stabilize the mother. The extraction of the first twin, Emma, went smoothly despite the challenging conditions. Alan had managed to create an opening just large enough for the small girl to squeeze through, and she followed his instructions perfectly, keeping her head down and her arms tucked close to her body as he guided her out of the wreckage. Once she was clear of the vehicle, he secured her in a harness and sent her up the embankment to waiting hands above, where she would receive immediate medical attention for her shoulder injury and shock. Olivia's extraction proved more complicated. The bleeding from her arm was more significant than Alan had initially realized, and the girl was beginning to show signs of blood loss that made her movements sluggish and uncoordinated. Additionally, Her position in the vehicle was such that she would need to be moved through a more difficult angle, requiring Alan to partially enter the wreckage himself to guide her out safely. "Okay, sweetheart, I'm going to come in there with you for just a minute," Alan explained as he carefully maneuvered his upper body through the opening he'd created. "I know it's scary, but I promise I'm going to get you out of here and up to your sister, okay?" Olivia nodded weakly, and Alan could see that she was fighting to stay conscious, her small hand pressed against the cut on her arm in an instinctive attempt to slow the bleeding. The space inside the crushed vehicle was even more confining than Alan had anticipated. The roof had been compressed to the point where he had to work in an awkward crouch, and there was barely enough room for him to maneuver alongside the child's car seat. Worse, he could smell gasoline more strongly now, and the entire vehicle seemed to shift slightly with his added weight, creaking ominously against the trees that were supporting it. "You're doing great, Olivia," Alan said as he worked to free the complex web of straps and buckles that secured her car seat. "Tell me about that book you and Emma were reading. What kind of horses were in the story?" The girl's response was faint but coherent, describing a tale about wild mustangs and the people who loved them, her voice growing stronger as she focused on something other than her fear and pain. Just as Alan managed to free Olivia from her restraints, the vehicle shifted again, this time more dramatically. The trees that had been supporting the SUV's weight were clearly beginning to give way under the strain, and Alan could hear the ominous sound of wood splintering and metal groaning. He had perhaps a minute, maybe two, before the entire wreckage would continue its tumble down the embankment, quite possibly taking him and the unconscious woman with it. "Hang on to me tight, sweetheart," Alan said as he gathered Olivia into his arms, her small body trembling with shock and blood loss. "We're going to move fast now, but I've got you, and I'm not going to let anything happen to you." The girl wrapped her uninjured arm around his neck with surprising strength, and Alan began the most dangerous part of the rescue, extracting both himself and the child from the unstable vehicle. He had just cleared the wreckage when the trees finally gave way completely. The SUV tumbled another 30 feet down the embankment before slamming into a massive boulder with a sound like thunder, the impact so violent that pieces of the vehicle were flung in all directions. Alan threw himself over Olivia, shielding her from the debris that rained down around them, feeling several sharp fragments tear through his protective gear and into his back and shoulders. When the noise finally stopped and the dust began to settle, Alan looked back at what remained of the SUV and felt his heart sink. The vehicle was now completely destroyed, compressed into a barely recognizable mass of twisted metal, and any hope of rescuing the girl's mother had died with that final impact. He held Olivia closer, knowing that she and her sister had just become orphans and that his successful rescue had been shadowed by a tragedy he'd been powerless to prevent. The climb back up the embankment with Olivia in his arms was exhausting work, made more difficult by his own injuries and the girl's weakening condition. Paramedic Williams met them halfway down, immediately taking charge of Olivia's medical care and starting in the fourth line to address her blood loss while Alan continued the ascent. By the time they reached the roadway, ambulances had arrived to transport both girls to Pine Valley General Hospital, where they would spend the next 3 days recovering from their injuries and processing the trauma of losing their mother. Alan rode in the ambulance with the twins, holding their hands and continuing to talk to them about anything he could think of to keep their minds occupied. He learned that they were 6 years old, that their mother's name had been Jennifer Walsh, and that they had been traveling back from a visit with their aunt in the next county when the accident occurred. Their father, according to Emma, traveled a lot for work and was currently somewhere in Europe on business, though neither girl was sure exactly where or when he would be returning. At the hospital, Alan stayed with the twins until social services could locate their father and arrange for his immediate return to the United States. During those long hours in the pediatric ward, he found himself growing deeply attached to the 2 little girls who had shown such remarkable courage in the face of unthinkable tragedy. Emma proved to be the more talkative of the twins, regaling him with stories about school and friends and her dreams of becoming a veterinarian. Olivia was quieter but equally engaging, showing him card tricks she'd learned and asking thoughtful questions about his work as a firefighter. When their father, Michael Walsh, finally arrived from London 3 days later, he was a man transformed by grief and guilt. A successful international consultant who had built his career on being available to clients around the world, he blamed himself for not being there when his family needed him most. Alan watched as the reunited family clung to each other in the hospital room, the twins finally able to properly grieve for their mother now that their father was there to hold them. Michael Walsh was profoundly grateful to Alan for saving his daughter's lives, but he was also a man overwhelmed by single parenthood and the logistics of rebuilding a life that had been shattered in an instant. Within weeks of the accident, he had made the decision to relocate the family to his company's headquarters in Chicago, where his mother could help care for the twins while he worked to establish some semblance of stability in their lives. The day the Walsh family left Pine Valley, Alan came to say goodbye, bringing with him 2 small stuffed horses he'd found at a local toy store, inspired by the book the girls had been reading on the day of the accident. Emma and Olivia hugged him fiercely, promising to write letters and stay in touch, their father shaking Alan's hand with tears in his eyes as he tried to find words adequate to express his gratitude. "I'll never forget what you did for us," Michael Walsh said, his voice thick with emotion. "If there's ever anything at all, that we can do for you or your family, please don't hesitate to call." He pressed a business card into Alan's hand, along with his personal contact information, but even as he made the promise, all 3 of them seemed to understand that this was likely goodbye forever. Life moved on in Pine Valley much as it always had. Alan returned to his duties with the fire department, earning a commendation for his actions during the Walsh rescue, and continuing to serve his community with the same dedication that had defined his career. His daughter Sophia grew from an 8-year-old into a teenager, then a young woman, eventually leaving for college to study environmental science, inspired by her father's commitment to protecting and serving others. The years brought changes to the department as well. Older firefighters retired and were replaced by younger men and women eager to prove themselves. Technology advanced, bringing new equipment and techniques that made rescues safer and more efficient. Alan found himself in the role of mentor and teacher, passing on the wisdom gained from 2 decades of emergency response to the next generation of first responders. But Alan also found himself facing new challenges as he entered his 50s. A back injury sustained during a warehouse fire had left him with chronic pain that made some aspects of his job more difficult. His reflexes, while still sharp, weren't quite what they'd been in his 30s, and he'd begun to notice that recovery from particularly strenuous calls took longer than it used to. Still, he remained one of the most respected and capable firefighters in the county, known for his calm leadership during crisis situations and his unwavering commitment to protecting lives. It was on a particularly busy Thursday evening in October, nearly 15 years after the Walsh rescue, that Alan's world was turned upside down by a call that should have been routine. Engine 47 had been dispatched to a structure fire at an apartment complex on the south side of town, a 2-story building that housed mostly elderly residents on fixed incomes. The fire had started in a first-floor unit and was spreading rapidly through the building's outdated electrical system. Alan and his crew arrived to find heavy smoke pouring from multiple windows and several residents gathered on the sidewalk in various states of dress, many clutching pets and small bags of belongings they'd managed to grab before evacuating. The building's fire alarm system appeared to be functioning, but there were concerns that some residents might not have heard the alarms or might be unable to evacuate on their own due to mobility issues or other health problems. "Rodriguez, Tate Martinez and Thompson and start search and rescue on the 2nd floor," Alan ordered as his crew began their well-rehearsed deployment. "I'll take the 1st floor and work my way toward the source of the fire. Williams, get me a water line in there as soon as you can establish a source." The team moved with the efficiency born of years of working together, each man knowing his role and trusting the others to perform theirs. The interior of the building was a maze of narrow hallways and small apartments, filled with smoke so thick that visibility was reduced to just a few feet despite the powerful lights mounted on their helmets. Alan worked his way systematically through the 1st floor, calling out and listening for responses, checking each unit for residents who might be trapped or overcome by smoke. The heat was building steadily as the fire spread, and he could hear the ominous sound of the building's structure beginning to stress under the extreme temperatures. In apartment 1C, Alan found Mrs. Henderson, an 83-year-old woman who suffered from arthritis so severe that she moved with the aid of a walker. She had heard the fire alarms but had been unable to evacuate quickly enough, and was now overcome by smoke inhalation and barely conscious. Alan scooped her up in his arms, feeling the fragility of her small frame as he carried her toward the exit, radioing his location and status to the incident commander as he moved. It was as he was handing Mrs. Henderson off to paramedics outside the building that the first sign of trouble emerged. Deputy Fire Chief Harrison approached him with a grim expression, holding what appeared to be an official document of some kind. Harrison was a political appointee who had been with the department for less than 2 years, a man more concerned with budget reports and public relations than with the practical realities of firefighting. "Rodriguez, I need to talk to you," Harrison said, his voice carrying an edge that Alan had never heard before. "There's been a complaint filed about your actions during the Chen warehouse fire last month. Someone's claiming you violated safety protocols and endangered civilian lives." The words hit Alan like a physical blow, not just because of their content, but because of the timing. To be confronted with such an accusation while still wearing smoke-stained gear and having just carried an elderly woman to safety seemed like a cruel joke. The Chen warehouse fire had been a massive blaze that had threatened to spread to adjacent residential areas. Alan's crew had been the first to arrive on scene, and he had made the decision to enter the building to search for possible occupants despite reports that it was supposed to be empty. During that search, he had discovered that the warehouse was being used as an illegal drug manufacturing operation, with chemicals and equipment that made the building far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. "What kind of complaint?" Alan asked, trying to keep his voice steady despite the confusion and anger building inside him. "I followed every protocol we have. Hell, if I hadn't gone in there when I did, we never would have known about the meth lab, and the whole damn block could have gone up when those chemicals ignited." But even as he spoke, Alan could see that Harrison's mind was already made up about something, his expression suggesting that this conversation was more formality than fact-finding mission. "The complaint alleges that you entered the structure without proper authorization, that you failed to wait for hazmat support, and that your actions ultimately delayed the suppression efforts and put other firefighters at risk." Harrison continued, reading from what Alan now realized was an official department document. "There's also a suggestion that you may have contaminated the crime scene, interfering with the police investigation into the drug operation." The absurdity of the accusations was almost overwhelming. Alan had been fighting fires for 23 years without a single serious violation of protocol, and his actions during the Chen warehouse incident had been not only appropriate, but heroic. The drug lab had been completely unknown to authorities before his discovery, and his early detection had allowed for proper hazmat procedures to be implemented before anyone was seriously injured by chemical exposure. "Chief, this is ridiculous," Alan said, his voice rising despite his efforts to remain calm. "Check the incident reports, talk to my crew, review the timeline. Everything I did that night was by the book, and if there's anyone suggesting otherwise, they either weren't there or they have some other agenda." But Harrison was already backing away, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation and eager to distance himself from what was obviously going to become a messy situation. "Look, Rodriguez, I'm not saying I believe the complaints, but they've been filed and they have to be investigated," Harrison said, his tone suggesting that he was merely following orders from higher up the chain of command. "You're going to be placed on administrative leave pending a full review of the incident. Turn in your gear and report to headquarters tomorrow morning for a formal interview with Internal Affairs." The drive home that night was one of the longest of Alan's life. Administrative leave meant he would be stripped of his duties and barred from responding to calls while investigators examined every aspect of his actions during the warehouse fire. Worse, he knew that in the current political climate surrounding the fire department, with budget cuts looming and public scrutiny increasing, there would be pressure to find someone to blame for any incident that attracted negative attention. At 57 years old, with 30 years of service and just 8 years from retirement, Alan found himself facing the possibility that his career would end in disgrace over accusations he knew to be false. The irony wasn't lost on him that a lifetime spent saving others could be destroyed by anonymous complaints from people who hadn't even been present during the incident in question. The investigation that followed was a nightmare of bureaucracy and second-guessing that stretched on for months. Internal Affairs investigators went over every detail of the Chen warehouse fire with a fine-tooth comb, interviewing witnesses, reviewing radio transcripts, and examining physical evidence. Alan's crew stood by him uniformly, testifying that his actions had been not only appropriate but exemplary, but the political pressure to find fault seemed to grow with each passing week. The local media picked up the story after someone leaked details of the investigation to a reporter known for sensational coverage of public safety issues. Suddenly, Alan found himself portrayed in newspaper articles and television reports as a rogue firefighter whose cowboy tactics had allegedly endangered lives and compromised investigations. The fact that no one had actually been hurt during the warehouse incident, and that his actions had led to the discovery of a dangerous illegal operation, seemed to get lost in the narrative of official misconduct and departmental cover-ups. Sophia, now 23 and working as an environmental consultant in Denver, called her father daily during the ordeal, offering support and encouragement while struggling to understand how someone who had dedicated his life to helping others could be treated so unfairly. "Dad, everyone who knows you understands what kind of person you are," she would say during their conversations. "This will blow over, and when it does, you'll be stronger for having gone through it." But as winter turned to spring and the investigation dragged on, Alan began to doubt whether justice would prevail. The department seemed eager to resolve the matter by finding him guilty of some lesser violation that would justify a suspension or demotion, allowing them to claim they had addressed the complaints without admitting any systemic problems. His union representative was competent but overworked, juggling dozens of cases and clearly more interested in negotiating a plea deal than in fighting for Alan's complete vindication. It was on a gray morning in April, almost 6 months after the investigation had begun, that Alan received the call that would change everything. He was in his kitchen, drinking coffee and reading yet another newspaper article that portrayed him as a symbol of everything wrong with the fire department, when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize from an area code he couldn't place. "Is this Alan Rodriguez?" the voice on the other end asked, female and young, with an accent that suggested education and confidence. The firefighter who worked for Pine Valley Fire Department? Alan confirmed his identity, expecting another reporter or perhaps another investigator with more questions about incidents from his past, but the woman's next words left him speechless. "Mr. Rodriguez, my name is Emma Walsh, and I think you saved my life when I was 6 years old." The pause that followed seemed to stretch forever as Alan's mind raced back 15 years to a rain-soaked embankment and 2 terrified little girls trapped in an overturned SUV. "I've been looking for you for years, and I just saw a news article online about your situation. I think my sister and I need to talk to you." The reunion took place in a coffee shop near the Pine Valley Courthouse, chosen because Emma and her twin sister Olivia were both attending law school at the state university and had driven down specifically to meet with Alan. As he waited for them to arrive, Alan found himself trying to reconcile his memories of 2 frightened 6-year-olds with the young women he was about to encounter. 15 years was a lifetime at their age, and he wondered if they would even remember the details of that terrible night, or if their memories had been shaped by stories told by others. When Emma and Olivia Walsh walked into the coffee shop, Alan recognized them immediately, despite the passage of time. They had grown into beautiful young women, both tall and blonde like their mother, but carrying themselves with a confidence and purpose that spoke of lives well lived despite their tragic beginning. Emma was slightly taller, her hair longer, and she moved with the kind of energy that suggested someone accustomed to taking charge of situations. Olivia was quieter, more observant, her eyes taking in every detail of her surroundings with the analytical precision of someone trained to notice what others missed. "Mr. Rodriguez?" Emma asked as she approached his table, her voice exactly as he remembered it despite the years that had passed. "I'm Emma, and this is Olivia. Thank you so much for agreeing to meet with us." The handshakes and initial greetings were awkward, all 3 of them struggling with the emotional weight of the reunion and the strange circumstances that had brought them back together. "I have to admit, I've thought about you girls many times over the years," Alan said as they settled into their seats, coffee cups providing something to focus on during the initial moments of conversation. "I've wondered how you were doing, whether you were okay, if you even remembered what happened that night." Both young women smiled at his words, and Olivia reached into her purse to pull out a small, well-worn stuffed horse that Alan recognized immediately. "We never forgot," Olivia said softly, setting the toy on the table between them. "Emma still has hers too. These horses have been with us through everything, every move, every school change, every major event in our lives. They remind us that even in the worst moments, there are people who will risk everything to help strangers." The sight of the toy horse, its fur matted from years of love and handling, brought tears to Alan's eyes as memories of that terrible night came flooding back. Emma leaned forward, her expression intense with purpose. "Mr. Rodriguez, we read about what's happening to you with the fire department, and we can't stand by and let them destroy the reputation of the man who saved our lives. We're both in our final year of law school, and we've been studying cases exactly like yours. What's happening to you is wrong, and we want to help." Over the next hour, Alan learned about the lives that Emma and Olivia had built in the 15 years since their mother's death. Their father had indeed moved them to Chicago, where they had been raised by their paternal grandmother, while Michael Walsh had worked to rebuild his career and create a stable home for his daughters. Both girls had excelled academically, driven by a sense of purpose that seemed to stem directly from their early experience with tragedy and loss. Emma had focused her legal studies on civil rights and public sector advocacy, drawn to cases involving firefighters, police officers, and other first responders who found themselves targeted by political pressure or bureaucratic scapegoating. Olivia had chosen a different path within the law, specializing in criminal defense and investigative techniques. But both sisters shared a passion for justice that Alan could see burning in their eyes as they spoke. "The articles we've read about your case make it clear that someone is trying to railroad you," Olivia said, her voice carrying the kind of analytical precision that Alan imagined would serve her well in a courtroom. "The timeline doesn't add up. The witnesses all support your version of events, and the complaints seem to have appeared out of nowhere months after the incident. This has all the hallmarks of a political hit job." Emma nodded in agreement, pulling out a folder filled with newspaper clippings and printed internet articles about Alan's case. "We've been researching similar cases around the country, and there's a pattern here. Veteran first responders get targeted when departments are under budget pressure or political scrutiny. It's easier to sacrifice one person than to address systemic problems or defend against frivolous complaints." As the conversation continued, Alan found himself amazed not just by the young women's legal knowledge and analytical skills, but by their determination to help him despite having no obligation to do so. They had successful lives and promising careers ahead of them, yet they were willing to risk their time and reputation to defend a man they barely knew, simply because he had once done his job and saved their lives. "I don't understand," Alan said finally, overwhelmed by their offer of assistance. "Why would you want to get involved in something like this? You have your own lives, your own futures to think about. This could get messy, and it might not even help." But both sisters looked at him as if the answer should be obvious, their expressions showing the same determination he had seen in their 6-year-old faces 15 years earlier. "Because it's the right thing to do," Emma said simply. "And because we learned from you that night that when someone is in trouble, you don't walk away just because it's dangerous or difficult. You taught us that the most important thing in life is to help people who can't help themselves, and right now, that's you." The formal hearing into Alan's conduct was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late May, with the fire department's board of review set to determine whether he would face disciplinary action, suspension, or termination based on the allegations surrounding the Chen warehouse incident. Alan's union representative had prepared him for what was likely to be a perfunctory proceeding, with the board having already made up their minds to impose some form of punishment in order to appease the political pressures they were facing. The hearing room in the Pine Valley Municipal Building was packed beyond capacity, with far more people in attendance than anyone had expected for what should have been a routine administrative proceeding. Local media representatives occupied the front rows, their cameras and recording equipment ready to capture what they anticipated would be the downfall of a veteran firefighter. Behind them sat current and former members of the fire department, some there to support Alan, others curious to see how the department would handle what had become a highly publicized case. But it was the presence of Emma and Olivia Walsh in the gallery that drew the most attention. Two impeccably dressed young women whose purpose for being there remained unclear to everyone except Alan himself. They had arrived early and taken seats directly behind the area where Allen would be sitting with his attorney, their presence serving as a visible reminder of lives he had saved and the good he had done during his career. Deputy Fire Chief Harrison served as the department's primary witness against Allen, presenting a carefully constructed case that portrayed the veteran firefighter as a loose cannon whose disregard for proper procedures had created unnecessary risks during the warehouse incident. Using PowerPoint presentations and carefully selected witness testimony, Harrison painted a picture of a department struggling to maintain safety standards while dealing with aging personnel who refused to adapt to modern protocols. Mr. Rodriguez's actions during the incident in question represent exactly the kind of outdated thinking that puts both firefighters and civilians at risk. Harrison testified, his voice carrying the authority of his position despite his limited actual experience fighting fires. His decision to enter an unsecured structure without proper backup or hazmat support violated multiple department policies and could have resulted in serious injuries or deaths. Allen's union representative, David Preston, did his best to counter Harrison's narrative, calling witnesses from Allen's crew who testified about his exemplary service record and the appropriateness of his actions during the warehouse fire. But Preston was clearly outmatched by the department's legal team, and his presentation lacked the polish and preparation that Harrison's case had displayed. As the morning wore on, it became increasingly clear that the board was prepared to find Allen guilty of at least some violations, with the only question being the severity of his punishment. Board Chairman Robert Foster had already made several comments that suggested he viewed Allen as a symbol of everything wrong with the old guard of the fire department, and his questions during testimony seemed designed more to justify a predetermined conclusion than to seek the truth. It was just after lunch, as the hearing was moving toward its conclusion, that Emma Walsh stood up in the gallery and asked permission to address the board. The request was highly irregular, given that she was not a party to the proceeding and had no official standing in the matter. But the unusual nature of the case and the media attention it had generated seemed to give Foster pause about denying her request outright. "Young lady, this is an official department proceeding, not a public forum," Foster said, his tone suggesting both irritation and curiosity about why a well-dressed young woman would want to interrupt his hearing. "Unless you have some official capacity or direct knowledge of the incident under investigation, I'm afraid you'll need to wait until the proceeding is concluded to make any statements." "Your Honor, I am Emma Walsh, and this is my sister Olivia," Emma said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone trained in courtroom procedure. "We are both third-year law students, and we have direct knowledge of Mr. Rodriguez's character and capabilities that we believe is essential to this proceeding." She paused, looking directly at Allen before continuing. 15 years ago, this man saved our lives." The courtroom fell silent as Emma's words sank in. Foster leaned forward in his chair, clearly intrigued, despite his earlier dismissiveness. While the media representatives began frantically taking notes and adjusting their cameras to capture what was obviously about to become the most significant moment of the hearing. "Mr. Rodriguez pulled my sister and me from an overturned vehicle after a car accident that killed our mother," Emma continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "We were 6 years old, trapped in a crushed SUV that was leaking gasoline and positioned precariously on an embankment. Any reasonable person would have waited for additional equipment or backup. But Mr. Rodriguez didn't hesitate. He rappelled down that embankment in the rain, in the dark, and he got us out of that car minutes before it tumbled another 30 feet and was completely destroyed." Olivia stood beside her sister, her presence adding weight to Emma's testimony. "The vehicle Mr. Rodriguez risked his life to enter was far more dangerous than the warehouse are condemning him for," Olivia added, her voice carrying the analytical precision that had served her well in law school. "There was pooling gasoline, unstable positioning, and a structure that was actively collapsing. By the standards being applied to him today, his actions that night violated every safety protocol imaginable. But those actions saved their lives." Allen felt tears welling up in his eyes as he listened to the young women defend him with a passion and eloquence that his own attorney had been unable to muster. Around the courtroom, he could see the faces of board members and spectators changing as they processed this unexpected testimony from two articulate, obviously successful young women who had no reason to like Kainsa about their experiences. Furthermore, Emma continued, we've spent the last several weeks investigating the allegations against Mr. Rodriguez, and we've found significant discrepancies in the timeline of events and the credibility of the sources making these complaints. The primary complainant, a supposed witness to the warehouse incident, was actually incarcerated on drug charges at the time the fire occurred. The secondary complaints all came from individuals with known grudges against the fire department related to previous employment disputes. Foster was clearly struggling to maintain control of what had become far more than a routine disciplinary hearing. The media attention alone would make any decision the board reached a matter of public record. And the testimony of the Walsh sisters had completely shifted the narrative from Alan as a reckless veteran to Alan as a hero being persecuted for political reasons. These are serious allegations you're making about the integrity of this investigation, Foster said, his voice carrying a warning tone. Do you have documentation to support these claims? Olivia stepped forward, pulling a thick folder from her briefcase with the smooth confidence of someone who had prepared for exactly this question. We have copies of incarceration records, employment files, and witness statements that directly contradict the allegations being made against Mr. Rodriguez, Olivia said, approaching the board's table with her evidence. We also have testimony from 12 current and former firefighters, 6 police officers, and 4 emergency medical technicians, all of whom worked with Mr. Rodriguez over the years, and all of whom describe him as one of the most professional and safety-conscious first responders they've ever encountered. As Olivia presented her evidence to the stunned board members, Emma turned to address the packed courtroom directly, her voice carrying to the back rows where television cameras were capturing every word for the evening news broadcasts. Ladies and gentlemen, we are witnessing an injustice today, Emma said, her words carrying the passionate conviction of someone who had dedicated her life to fighting for what was right. A man who has spent 30 years saving lives, who has risked everything repeatedly to protect strangers, is being destroyed by a system that values political convenience over truth and justice. This cannot stand. Mr. Rodriguez didn't just save our lives that night 15 years ago, Emma continued, her voice growing stronger as she warmed to her subject. He showed us what it means to be truly brave, to put the welfare of others above your own safety, to do what's right even when it's dangerous and difficult. Every lesson we've learned about justice, every principle that has guided our legal education, we learned first from watching this man risk everything for 2 little girls he'd never met. The impact of Emma's speech was immediate and dramatic. Several board members were clearly moved by her testimony, while others seemed uncomfortable with the direction the hearing had taken. In the gallery, current firefighters were nodding in agreement, and even some of the media representatives seemed to be reconsidering their previous coverage of the case. But it was Foster's reaction that mattered most, and Alan could see that the board chairman was struggling with a situation that had spiraled far beyond his control. What should have been a simple disciplinary action had become a public referendum on the treatment of veteran first responders, with 2 articulate young lawyers presenting evidence that the entire investigation had been based on false premises. Ms. Walsh, Foster said, addressing both sisters formally for the first time. While your testimony is certainly moving, this board has a responsibility to follow proper procedures and base our decisions on the evidence presented through official channels. We cannot simply ignore department policies because of personal testimonials, however compelling they might be. Your Honor, with respect, we're not asking you to ignore policies, Olivia responded, her legal training evident in the way she structured her argument. We're asking you to consider that the evidence against Mr. Rodriguez is fundamentally flawed, and that the man being accused is not the reckless firefighter portrayed in these charges, but rather someone whose entire career has been dedicated to protecting lives and property." End quote. Emma stepped forward to join her sister, and together they presented a united front that reminded Alan powerfully of the 6-year-old girls who had clung to each other in the wreckage of their family's SUV. "Mr. Rodriguez taught us that the right thing to do is often the hard thing to do," Emma said. "He taught us that when someone is in danger, you don't worry about protocol or personal safety, you act. Those lessons have shaped everything we've done since that night, including our decision to become lawyers and fight for justice. And now, Olivia added. We're asking this board to do the right thing, even though it might be the hard thing. We're asking you to look past the politics and the pressure and see this case for what it really is. An attempt to scapegoat a good man for problems that have nothing to do with his actions or his character. The hearing recessed for 45 minutes while the board deliberated, during which time the courtroom buzzed with excited conversations about the unexpected turn of events. Alan found himself surrounded by colleagues and supporters who had been energized by the Walsh sisters' testimony, while Emma and Olivia fielded questions from reporters who seemed eager to understand more about their relationship with the firefighter they had so passionately defended. "I still can't believe you did this," Alan said to the young women during the recess, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't owe me anything, and you've put yourselves at risk by getting involved in something this controversial." But Emma shook her head, smiling with the same determination he remembered from their childhood. "Mr. Rodriguez, you saved our lives when we were children, but more than that, you showed us what kind of people we wanted to become," Emma said. "Everything good we've accomplished since that night, every person we've been able to help through our legal work, flows directly from the example you set for us. We're not repaying a debt, we're continuing a mission you started." When the board reconvened, Foster's expression suggested that the deliberation had been anything but routine. The other board members looked equally serious, and Alan could see that they were all acutely aware of the media attention and public scrutiny that their decision would receive. This board has carefully considered all the evidence presented today, including the testimony of Ms. Emma Walsh and Ms. Olivia Walsh regarding Mr. Rodriguez's character and past service. Foster began, his voice carrying none of the confidence it had displayed earlier in the day. "We have also reviewed the additional documentation provided by the Walsh sisters regarding discrepancies in the original investigation." Alan held his breath, knowing that his career and reputation hung in the balance of Foster's next words. Beside him, his attorney was equally tense, while behind him, he could feel Emma and Olivia waiting for the verdict that would determine whether their dramatic intervention had been successful. After careful consideration, this board finds that the allegations against Mr. Rodriguez are not supported by credible evidence, Foster continued, his words causing a stir throughout the packed courtroom. "Furthermore, we find that Mr. Rodriguez's actions during the warehouse incident were appropriate and consistent with department policies and the highest traditions of the Pine Valley Fire Department." The courtroom erupted in applause and cheers from Alan's supporters, while the media representatives scrambled to capture the dramatic conclusion to what had become one of the most closely watched disciplinary hearings in the Bell Department's history. Alan felt as if a massive weight had been lifted from his shoulders, but his first thought was not of his own vindication, but of gratitude to the two young women whose courage and determination had saved his career just as surely as he had once saved their lives. "Mr. Rodriguez, this board wishes to express its appreciation for your 30 years of distinguished service to the Pine Valley Fire Department and the community," Foster concluded, his tone suggesting genuine respect for the first time during the entire proceeding. "Your record of service speaks for itself, and this board finds no basis for any disciplinary action against you." As the formal hearing concluded and the courtroom began to empty, Alan turned to find Emma and Olivia standing behind him, both young women clearly emotional about the outcome of their dramatic intervention. The three of them stood together for a moment, surrounded by the chaos of reporters and well-wishers, but focused only on each other and the strange journey that had brought them back together after 15 years. "Thank you," Alan said simply, knowing that no words could adequately express his gratitude for what they had done. "Thank you for everything." Emma reached out and hugged him tightly, followed by Olivia, and for a moment all three of them are transported back to that terrible night when a firefighter's courage had saved two little girls and changed all their lives. Forever. "Thank you for teaching us what it means to be brave," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise of the dispersing crowd. "Thank you for showing us that the right thing to do is always worth doing, no matter what it costs." Olivia nodded in agreement, her eyes bright with tears as she looked at the man who had shaped her understanding of justice and courage without even knowing it. In the weeks that followed the hearing, Alan's vindication became a local news story that eventually attracted national attention. The Walsh sisters were interviewed by several major news outlets about their decision to defend the firefighter who had saved their lives. And their story resonated with audiences across the country, who were inspired by their loyalty and determination to fight for justice. The investigation into the false allegations against Allen eventually revealed a pattern of corruption within the fire department's administration, leading to the resignation of Deputy Fire Chief Harrison and several other officials who had been involved in what amounted to a coordinated attempt to scapegoat veteran firefighters. The scandal ultimately resulted in reforms that strengthened protections for first responders against politically motivated accusations. Allen returned to active duty with his reputation not only restored, but enhanced by the public support he had received during his ordeal. His remaining years with the department were marked by increased respect from colleagues and community members who had followed his case and been impressed by both his character and the loyalty he had inspired in the people whose lives he had touched. Emma and Olivia Walsh graduated from law school with honors and went on to establish successful legal careers, with Emma specializing in civil rights cases involving first responders, and Olivia building a practice focused on criminal defense and wrongful prosecution cases. Both sisters credited their decision to enter the legal profession to lessons they had learned from Allen about fighting for justice and protecting those who could not protect themselves. The two stuffed horses that had connected them to their childhood trauma and their heroic rescuer eventually found permanent homes on the shelves of their respective law offices, serving as daily reminders of the night that had shaped their understanding of courage, justice, and the importance of standing up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. Years later, when Allen finally retired from the Pine Valley Fire Department after 35 years of service, Emma and Olivia were among the speakers at his retirement ceremony, their words bringing tears to the eyes of everyone present, as they described the lasting impact that one firefighter's courage had had not only on their lives, but on everyone they had been able to help through their legal careers. "Mr. Rodriguez saved our lives when we were 6 years old," Emma told the assembled crowd of firefighters, family members, and community leaders. "But more importantly, he's shown us what it means to dedicate your life to serving others, to risk everything for strangers, and to never give up on doing what's right. Every person we've been able to help, every injustice we've been able to correct, every victory we've won in courtrooms across this country exists because a firefighter named Allen Rodriguez taught us that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it." End quote. Olivia's words were equally moving as she reflected on the journey that had brought them all together again after so many years. "We learned that night that there are people in this world who will risk everything to save strangers, who will run toward danger when everyone else is running away, and who will fight for justice even when it costs them dearly. Mr. Rodriguez didn't just save our lives that night, he showed us how to live them." As Allen stood before the crowd of people who had gathered to honor his career, he thought about the unexpected ways that life connects people across time and distance. How a single act of courage can ripple outward in ways that the actor could never imagine. The 6-year-old girls he had pulled from a crushed SUV had grown into powerful advocates for justice, and their intervention in his darkest hour had not only saved his career, but reminded him why he had chosen a life of service in the first place. The ceremony concluded with the presentation of a special commendation recognizing Allen's lifetime of service, but the moment that meant the most to him came afterward, when Emma and Olivia approached him with a gift they had prepared together. It was a photo album filled with pictures from their lives over the past 15 years, school graduations, law school ceremonies, first court victories, and family celebrations. Each image accompanied by a note explaining how the lessons they had learned from him had influenced their choices and achievements. "We wanted you to see what grew from the seeds you planted that night," Emma explained as Allen looked through the album with tears in his eyes. "Every good thing in these pictures, every success, every moment of happiness, exists because you chose to risk your life for 2 little girls you didn't even know. This is your legacy, Mr. Rodriguez, not just the fires you fought or the lives you saved directly, but all the good that flowed from your courage and compassion." The final page of the album contained a photograph of the 3 of them taken on the day of the hearing, standing together outside the municipal building after Allen's vindication had been announced. Below the picture, in handwriting that reminded Allen of the thank you notes the girls had sent him years earlier, was a simple message that captured the essence of their relationship and the profound impact that one night had had on all their lives. "To the bravest man we know, who taught us that heroes are not people who aren't afraid, but people who do what's right, despite their fear. Thank you for saving our lives. Thank you for teaching us how to save others. And thank you for showing us that the right thing to do is always worth doing, no matter what it costs. With love and gratitude that will last forever. Emma and Olivia Walsh. End quote. As Alan closed the album and looked at the two remarkable women who had once been frightened children in his arms, he realized that his career as a firefighter had been about much more than fighting fires and saving lives. It had been about planting seeds of courage and compassion that would grow and spread in ways he could never have imagined, touching countless lives and making the world a better place long after he had hung up his helmet for the final sonorade. Time. The story of Alan Rodriguez and the Walsh sisters became part of Pine Valley folklore, told and retold as an example of how single acts of heroism can create ripples that extend far beyond their immediate impact. For Alan, it served as a reminder that the true measure of a life spent in service is not the number of fires fought or lives saved, but the inspiration and courage that such service plants in the hearts of others, growing and multiplying across generations until the original act of heroism becomes a foundation for countless other acts of bravery and compassion. In the end, Alan understood that he had not just saved two little girls from a car wreck 15 years earlier, he had helped create two champions of justice whose own courage would go on to save countless others. And when those champions had stood up in a courtroom to defend him against false accusations, they had not just returned a favor, they had demonstrated the true power of heroism to transform lives and create a better world for everyone.